Welcome to episode 59 of Talking Dairy. Today's conversation is all about how Kiwi dairy farmers can get the most out of their fertiliser spend, which is particularly important in the current economic climate, of course. Now, we recorded this podcast in late July before the announced drop in forecast milk price, but we hope the content is just as relevant, if not more so. And likewise, even though we recorded it in July, it's still extremely wet in many parts of the country. My guests are the highly experienced and knowledgeable Dr. Ants Roberts, who's Chief Scientist at Ravensdown, and Warwick Catto, Science Strategy Manager at Ballance Agri-Nutrients Ltd. Before we get into this conversation, two quick notes. Firstly, August 6th was Farm Worker Appreciation Day, and we invited farmers to give a shout out on social media to any employees who'd gone above and beyond on the job. The response was amazing, with hundreds of you praising your farm staff. The winner of our $200 Prezi card is Georgie Van Huven, who wrote the following. Our new 2IC Rahul had an issue with a fence post this morning, but he'd already dug a hole and replaced it by 10 a.m. He's doing a great job. Jody has kept the shed in tip-top order this season and things are going very smoothly. Hannah has been fantastic in the weekends, always turning up with a great smile. Thanks team, you rock. Congrats to Georgie and the team, a Prezi card is on its way. Secondly, as always, just a reminder to subscribe to Talking Dairy so you get a notification when our new episodes go live. My name is Ben Chapman-Smith, thanks for listening and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, so Ants and Warwick, thank you very, very much for giving up your time today to join us on Talking Dairy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Hey, you guys have both been in the industry for a long time. What kind of trends are you seeing in fertiliser use and how have things changed over time? Warwick, do you want to go first?
Yeah, for me, I started around 1990, and the interesting thing trend is for PK&S, phosphate, potash, sulphur, nothing much has changed. It's nitrogen that's probably been the big story in the last 30 years, and probably the opposite trend of that is the de-emphasis on legumes. And so one of the upsides of the regen conversation in the last few years is perhaps farmers are pivoting back and thinking more about the importance of clover in their sward. So that's probably the big trend that I'm seeing.
And Ants?
I obviously concur with Warwick's observations. I think that also the amount of PK&S type fertilisers has decreased in terms of total sales across the industry, given that there's less development now of more virgin land, if you like, and dairy conversions, etc. There's probably been a rise of branded products as opposed to when Warwick and I started. It was superphosphate, lime, urea, muriate of potassium chloride, and that would have done most farms at different quantities, etc. But so there has been some changes. I agree that there's a decrease now in emphasis on nitrogen fertiliser. It's still used a lot, but going back to clover, I think, is a very good thing as well.
Ants, with farmers' profit margins under pressure at the moment, what are some steps that they can take to make sure that they're spending their fert dollar as wisely as possible?
Clearly not doing the same as they've always done, getting some good advice, and that could come from fertiliser industry representatives or private consultants, but definitely getting some expert advice, obviously starting with soil testing, with herbage testing, and I always advocate for animal tissue testing as well. If you want to look across the whole range of macronutrients and micronutrients, having all three pieces of information gives you a much better decision-making basis. Doing more testing rather than less so that you can characterise the variability across a farm system. Even though you think you put the same rate on at the same, on every paddock and that the fertility will be the same, we know that it won't be the same. We know there's huge variability even on well-managed dairy farms. And so whole farm soil testing, which we can get into a little bit later, is a key to just making sure putting what you need, which nutrients at the right rates in the right places. That's the key to saving money now.
Warwick, can you afford to skip a soil test for a few years and save a bit of money? And also, are some soil tests better than others?
Yes, you can afford to skip soil testing if, the big if, you have some trend data there already. It's the most valuable asset there. So most dairy farmers have been sampling for a number of years and will have trend data. And so from that perspective, a trend shouldn't largely change as to what's going on. So that information is still valid. Even soil test data that's 2, potentially 3 years old is still valuable in terms of assessing what's going on at the moment. So you don't necessarily have to soil test, but if you've got particularly trend data, I'd rely heavily on that in terms of prioritising what you are. Are all soil tests all the same? I think the most important thing is the monitoring soil test paddocks. So the ones that you've built, the trend lines are the ones you should rely on. They're the valuable ones. And I guess ultimately is making sure they've been sampled appropriately. But that, on the basis that's a given, put your weight on your long-term trend paddocks.
Could I chip in there, Ben?
Go for it, Ents.
Yeah, look, so trends are important because soil tests are variable year to year because of biological and climatic reasons, etc. But I really think that given that you started off by saying times are tight, that the amount of money you spend on soil tests is trivial compared to the amount that you're spending on fertiliser. And so it's really important to use good information to drive that decision making. I think we should be doing more soil testing, not less, and not skipping out just because you think you're saving a little bit of money on soil testing.
Yeah, soil testing's cheap relative to the fertiliser trend, but if everyone wants a soil test done this spring, it's not realistic to happen. There's always capacity about getting it. So ideally you'd get a soil test done, but it's not the end of the world if you don't, so long as you've got good historic data to rely upon. But new soil testing is always the best option.
And in terms of, are some soil tests better than others? The ones that are calibrated to New Zealand farm systems have to be used. There's plenty of other soil tests floating around, which some people will tell you is useful, but in our experience, they're not.
What are the benefits of sampling every paddock separately?
So that was what I was referring to as whole farm soil testing. Obviously, you don't do that every year, but what you're trying to determine is, have I got paddocks that are higher than they need to be in terms of PK or S or pH? Have we got ones that are lower and therefore below the optimum sort of levels and therefore restricting pasture production and quality? And do I have a lot in the middle range where at the targets that I want my farm to be at based on my productivity, my soils, my climate, etc.? That gives the opportunity for robbing Peter to pay Paul in terms of when times are tight. You can withhold or reduce rates on the high paddocks and put them on the low paddocks to bring those up to optimum and just keep the optimal ones going. And so we've found in doing that over the last 10 or so years that on just about every dairy farm, there's about 30% higher than they should be, 30% lower than they could be, and the other 30% sitting in the optimum range, just to give you an idea of the sort of variability.
The challenge with all paddock soil testing is, what are you going to do about it? It's all very well testing every paddock, but are you actually going to variable rate spread the fertiliser, which is the other key piece of the puzzle?
Absolutely. And so there's no point whole farm soil testing if you don't do what Warwick just said. And we would recommend that if you do then act on the information, that then you retest whole farm soil test every 5 years or so.
Hey, where do herbage tests such as clover-only tests fit in with this in terms of making smart fert decisions?
Herbage testing is a valuable complementary tool. I look at it the lens of fine-tuning, particularly for things like potassium and sulphur, which the soil tests can be rather more variable with respect to. And the other attribute they bring in is micronutrients. So Anne's referred earlier about animal nutrition, so you can pick up cobalt, copper, selenium, molybdenum, and some of those things could be the limiting factor in terms of what's going on in the farm. So I think they're very complementary. The timing is different in terms of when you want them. So nice vegetative growth in the spring is often the ideal time. Clover-only samples are the preferred sample if you can get. So, yeah, a fine-tuning tool is the lens I would look at it.
And just to add to that, You actually need mixed pasture samples if you're worried about animal nutrition in terms of the trace elements supplied to animals. Clover only for fine-tuning the nutrient content, because, everything we do in terms of fertiliser and soil management is to really promote the growth and function of the clover component of the sward, which is getting competed quite strongly by the associated grasses and herbs that are growing alongside it. And so we lift the fertility of the soil really to promote clover growth because it has a poorer root system, etc. But the herbage tests, the clover-only herbage tests, are particularly important if you're looking for a molybdenum deficiency in clover or a boron deficiency, because the calibrations of those tests are for clover only, not mixed herbage. I know people take mixed herbage samples and give farmers recommendations for molybdenum and boron, which are incorrect, because they're using the criteria for clover for mixed pastures, which is not relevant. So that's important.
Soil testing crop paddocks. Warwick, how do we go about that and when?
Timing is before the crop is due to go in. Probably the most important test is probably the nitrogen test, and there's a range of nitrogen tests, but the main labs all do those. Probably the key point around soil testing crop paddocks is typically, given they're all forage crops we're probably talking about, their PK&S requirements would probably be met by the nutrient levels that the pastures that it's coming out of would provide. So often the question is, apart from maintaining that soil fertility, how much additional nitrogen, if any, is required? And certainly in high fertile soils, very little nitrogen will be there. So for me, it's probably not a compulsory thing to do. It's probably based on the amount of how nitrogen responsive the site is you've got. That's the one that probably there's some discretion thinking around that, and what the yield expectation is for the season. So if you're going into a better growing conditions or a drier period, depending on what your forecast is, then you dial up or dial down the nitrogen based on that yield expectation.
There is a new tool available to help that nitrogen decision. Plant and Food have just recently released a new soil test called the Potentially Mineralisable N test, which tells you, which again you take before the crop goes in, you'll get your mineral nitrogen, which is the nitrogen that's sitting there ready for the crop to take up when it emerges and starts growing. But then there's the soil organic matter, which the bugs are breaking down, releasing nitrogen during the life of that crop. And so we should take that into account in terms of the total nitrogen supply for that crop. And therefore we can, if we know what that is and over what time period that is during the growth of that crop, we can reduce our amount of nitrogen fertiliser that we need to add accordingly, which is good from a cost effectiveness point of view, but also from an environmental management point of view.
Just adding to that, Ants, dairy effluent's a rich source of potassium and nitrogen, and particularly for maize crop areas, thinking about how you can put effluent or solids from your pond into those crop areas is a way to economise in terms of nutrient. Effluent's a great source of nutrient. It's a great zone where you can target putting that the solids on those areas.
Yeah, there's been research done in the Waikato, hasn't there, Warwick, where they planted maize on effluent paddocks and put no fertiliser on at all and got just as good a yields as any well-fertilised block. So, and it's certainly a good way of reducing the potassium and nitrogen on those effluent blocks, which can, if they're too small, if there's been a lot of effluent put on historically, they get very high levels. So it's a good use of those nutrients.
Warwick, how important is lime? Can you apply too much? And if dollars are tight, can farmers skip the fert for a while and just put on lime?
Are you focused on cost or are you focused on value? Goes back to that issue of what do your soil tests tell you? Lime, if you don't need lime, if your pH levels are good, is an expensive input. Even if it is cheap, it's still an expense. So is lime value for money? Yes, it can be if your soils are responsive to lime. If they're not, then it's just added cost. The responses are typically smaller, and lime is very valuable. It's part of that suite of nutrients is lime, PK&S, so they all need to go on. You can actually mix them and put them on together. My philosophy around lime is go back and look at your soil tests and work where the best value is going to come from, not where the cost is going to come from.
Yeah. because lime only has one of the essential nutrients, which is calcium, as opposed to fertiliser, which may contain many more. There is an old Yorkshire saying, Ben, that says lime and lime without manure makes both farm and farmer poor. So, you have to use it where it's appropriate, as Warwick says. If the pH is low and you want to bring it up, by all means. You also have to maintain pH, because pastoral farming is a net acidification system, just naturally through biology and past plant growth and nitrogen cycling, etc., acidifies the soil over time. So every so often, farmers would have to at least put some maintenance lime on, but that's part of the whole soil management program.
Ents, what are some things to do and not to do when it comes to actually applying the fertiliser, like excluding troughs and gateways? And also, do you have any advice around using accurate placement tools?
Well, technology is advancing all the time. And so we have more accurate equipment for ground spreading in particular, but also for aerial spreading. But we're talking dairy farming, so it's mostly ground spread. There is proof of placement, and I think that's going to become increasingly important for farmers to show that they're being good husbands of the land, and they can show where they put the fertiliser, at what rate, at what time. And so all of that's important. Obviously, missing gateways and places where soil has been disturbed, for example, around gateways, troughs, etc. Nothing's going to grow there because the animals are congregating there. Then obviously you want to try and avoid those areas. And these days, equipment allows you to do that more accurately. Obviously putting fertiliser in the right place at the right time is important. Chucking it onto farm races isn't going to be very useful for those nutrients, for example. So this is all the technology is going towards that. Apart from that, particularly down south where we have, large pivot irrigation and triangular paddocks, etc., there is quite significant fertility transfer, particularly around N and K, from the backs of paddocks to the gateways, etc. And there are some quite high gradients now built up. So even within paddock testing and variable rate within paddocks is a possibility now.
The other comment I would add to that, Ben, is calibrating your spreading equipment. So one is, where you're using a contractor, are they spread mark certified? It's an industry good scheme. It means that you're getting an even spread across the paddock, because, thinking about saving money, a poor spreading job is very poor value. And equally with your own spreader, put a few trays or ice cream bottles out and just have a look and see how far is it throwing that fertiliser, and then you know how far to drive apart going around the paddock, and that'll give you your best response and best value.
You touched on effluent before on the crop paddocks. Do you have any advice otherwise for using effluent smartly?
Well, it's a great resource. It's full of nutrients. It should be recycled back onto the grazed pasture where it originated from initially. And so, having good systems to spread farm dairy effluent onto a proportion of the farm. And obviously, the bigger the area, the more nutrients you're spreading around on those areas, and you can reduce your fertiliser nutrients accordingly. A nutrient budget helps you sort that out. What are the average applications of nutrients through the effluent, etc.? Obviously, your effluent area should have the right soil types, etc., so that they're not going to either run off across the surface or leach heavily, etc. So there is some expertise required in determining which soils on your farm will be the best for that effluent application. And then, having the right equipment and not ponding the effluent on the surface, etc., all is around effluent management. And there's plenty of DairyNZ and industry guidelines around how to do all that properly.
If you haven't got an analysed nutrient budget, if you've got an overseas nutrient budget, it gives you a lot of advice around the appropriate area and the nutrients that are there. But I guess the big issue in years like this year we've just had and are still experiencing how wet it is, it's actually managing the water levels in the pond. So managing that side of it's probably the priority at the moment, I would think.
Let's talk about nitrogen fertiliser. Firstly, when is the best time to put it on, and in what quantity?
The essential thing is, if you have managed your soils well, your base nutrients, your pH, etc., your trace elements are all there, we still know that pastures will respond to extra nitrogen fertiliser, even if your clovers are cranking throughout most of the spring-summer period. And so using nitrogen on pastures is really about identifying pasture deficits ahead of time, and then using nitrogen tactically to grow extra pasture into those periods of deficit. So traditionally, that's, the shoulders of the season, for example, late winter, early spring, and then in autumn and in certain areas. And because people in Canterbury and other places have irrigation, of course, the temptation is to keep using nitrogen right through the season. Whereas rain-fed areas, the rest of the country, often goes into a moisture limitation in December, January, February. So obviously nitrogen fertiliser is not appropriate to be used then. You're not going to get an effective response. So it's about matching feed supply with feed demand and using nitrogen tactically.
Nitrogen's roughly about $2 a kilogram at the moment. So that's 20 cents a kilogram of dry matter in terms of the cost. So one of the things is probably spelling interval. So if you think of your rotation lengths, so following the cows around gives you a longer spelling interval, gives you more time for that nitrogen to be converted into a dry matter response. So on really fast rounds, if they're 15 or less than 20 days, do think about lower rates, below around 20, 25 kilos of end in terms of those fast rotations. You can use higher rates if you have a longer rotation length. As a rule of thumb, not that I'm a great endorser of rule of thumbs, a kilo of N per grazing interval, to give you a bit of a gut feel as to how, because the grass can only use the nitrogen at a certain finite rate.
Just to add to that, I've had lots of discussions with South Island farmers of their fast rotations, Warwick. I reckon that's limiting their nitrogen response, and I've been suggesting to them they need to stretch those spring rotations out to 25 to 28 days if they can. They all throw their hands up in horror and say, no, we can't do that because we'll lose pasture quality and stuff. But so it's a trade-off between getting your best nitrogen response and using the least nitrogen possible, given that we now have 190 kilogram N per hectare cap. So, yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic at the moment.
Hey guys, obviously there's some pretty wet soils around the country at the moment. At the time of recording this in late July, this won't come out for a couple of weeks, but what are your thoughts on whether farmers should be putting in on to boost growth, or whether it's too wet? How wet is too wet? For example, if the spreaders are at risk of getting stuck, and if the paddocks are too wet for a truck, should they fly the N on?
Let's talk about the spreading thing. The pasture damage can be quite bad. So obviously it's more expensive to fly it on or to fixed wing or helicopter. So it's about 24 cents a kilogram of product to fly it on, and about 30 cents for a helicopter possibly. But if you can't ground spread it, then you haven't got much choice. So for me, the ground conditions damaging the paddock, you better to pay another way to get it put on, and particularly because timeliness is quite important. In terms of soil wetness, if the soil's too wet, you get very poor responses, and there's little to be gained by not waiting till the soil conditions get back to field capacity.
But it comes back to what we were saying before, is it's about matching feed supply with demand. And particularly in the Waikato, in the Bay of Plenty, where Warwick and I are sitting right now, there are people halfway through their calving already, and pasture growth has slowed down in the last month or so. And so people will be starting to consider, and in fact, people already are spreading nitrogen on some farms with the right soil conditions to make sure that they're not going to restrict their animals in terms of feed. So it's predicated on what is your feed supply going forward, and do you need to do something about it, and is nitrogen the cheapest option, or is purchase feed, or whatever is the decisions they have to make. So it's horses for courses.
Nitrogen's a growth accelerator. So if you haven't got growth because the ground's too wet or too dry or too cold, nitrogen won't do anything. It's a growth multiplier. So if you're not getting reasonable growth, then you won't get a good nitrogen response.
Yep. The scientific term is highly correlated to pasture growth after you've applied the nitrogen fertiliser. So, yeah. And obviously, don't apply nitrogen fertiliser if there's ponds of water sitting on the paddock, because your soils are saturated, and as Warwick says, the plants won't be doing anything, and you're at risk of leaching some of that nitrogen as well.
Should farmers in really wet regions be applying S as well as N?
So this is interesting, particularly on sedimentary soils, which are probably the majority of soils in dairying in the lower half of the North Island and most of the South Island, as opposed to volcanic soils in Waikato, Taranaki, Bay of Plenty, and Northland's sort of half and half, volcanic and sedimentary. On sedimentary soils, those soils don't hold sulfate sulfur very well against leaching over winter. And so particularly in the late winter, early spring applications to kick the farms off to the new lactation, it is important to put a small amount of S in with your nitrogen, and solely to minimise the risk of limiting the nitrogen application. So nitrogen response is you get more production of amino acids, which then go into making proteins and getting the growth response in your pastures. And two of the essential amino acids to make those proteins are sulfur containing. So if the climate has limited your sulfur supply coming out of a wet period, then just putting a bit of sulfur with your nitrogen helps maximize the chance of getting the best nitrogen response that you'll get depending on growth conditions post your application. Is that fair enough, Warwick?
Yep. If in doubt, put it on this year. It's been horrifically wet, as we know.
This year in particular.
Yeah. So if sulphur is ever going to be lost, it's a year like this it's going to be lost. But as Ant said, somewhere between 5 or 10 kilos of S, and then you could top up the sulphur later on during the late spring, summer period.
Both companies sell products with urea mixed with ammonium sulfate, which does the job.
Yep.
Still on this theme of rain, are we seeing more leaching, and has it affected what's happening in the soils?
Without doubt. We've had a fantastic rain season from January in the North Island to now, and it's raining outside my window now, and we've had good growth. It has slowed down, but we're also got full water tables. And so when soils are fully full of water and you get more rain, you get downward movement, drainage of water, and that takes the soluble nutrients like nitrate, sulfate, potassium, etc., down with it. And so I suspect that coming out of this and going into spring, we're going to need significant amounts of nitrogen and sulfur applications to maximise our chance of having a good season.
Yeah, and particularly given it's been a mild growing conditions as well. So growth, the other factor is growth has been occurring through the autumn-winter periods, which takes up nitrogen. So a lower N status in the spring is probably what you should expect.
And we've had warm winters before, Warwick, not quite as wet as this, but we've had warm winters before. And my experience is that come the time when you really want your pastures to kick off, they kind of run out of puff. They just sort of stop for a while and they think, I'm a bit tired. I don't want to grow. And right in the critical period, which is coming up in the next few weeks.
Warwick, some farmers might think that getting a fert rep out to the farm just means they're going to try and sell me more fert. Why is it worth getting that advice?
Both Ravensdown and Ballance are cooperatives. So our philosophy is around doing what's right for the farmer. I think by all means try and get a rep out. I think if everyone who listens to the podcast wants them, they may not get them. So I think start with a phone call first or an email and get some dialogue going as to what's going. But I think this is the type of year, and with all the questions we've discussed before, you don't need to remember them. Probably the key thing to remember is actually I need to get a rep to have a look at my soil test results or take new soil tests if they're required and provide me with some advice. And if you want a second opinion, you can get that. But to me, a year like this year is a year where these fert reps earn their money on behalf of you in terms of prioritising your spend and giving you the best fert program to fit a constrained budget.
Yeah, I don't take much credence in people saying fertiliser reps are just there to sell fertiliser, particularly from the cooperatives. And there's plenty of other farm advisors who can give you that second opinion that Warwick was talking about if you want. Although not all of them actually give the best advice either, so because they're not experts in soil fertility, which our staff are trained to be.
And Warwick, just last question for you. Why do most fert reps recommend that farmers concentrate on nitrogen, phosphate, potassium and sulfur when the plant must need some trace elements?
I'm not sure that's actually true.
No.
I think what the reps should be doing is rather than focusing on nitrogen, phosphate, potassium and sulfur, they should be focusing on sulfur, potassium, phosphate and then nitrogen, because sulfur is about $1 a kilogram. Potassium is about $2.50, phosphate's about between $4 and $5, and nitrogen's about $2 a kilogram. So they should be focusing on SKPN in that order because that's where they'll get the best value. Trace elements, particularly from an animal perspective, molybdenum, we focus on that, but They are important. They do need to be thought about, but the biggest bang for buck comes from the NPKs.
Yeah, and that's the reality. Obviously, as we talked before, pH is important to get that into the right pH range. But in terms of quantity of nutrients, PKS and lime are the ones that are most required if you want a productive pasture, which is going to grow you something like 15, 18 tonnes of good quality pasture per hectare per year. So that's why it seems that most plants focus on that. But have we done the soil, plant, animal tissue test, then we get a read on trace elements. The reality is that most trace elements, there are essential trace elements, iron, manganese, etc., which we never talk about. Why? Because our soils are chock full of plant available iron and manganese. And so we don't have to, and perhaps we should discuss this more with farmers, because some of the alternative nutrient management advisors that farmers have on their farms will focus on those things, and they think this is, great because it's new information. But the reality is you don't actually need it. You don't often need zinc, for example. You don't need a whole lot of the trace elements because we're relying on the soil material, which weathers over time to release those trace elements, etc. That's why there's not a lot of emphasis put on. Obviously, we know pumice soils are deficient in cobalt and copper often, and so we know some soils around New Zealand specifically don't have those trace elements, and therefore we add them. But a good rep will put those into the fertiliser program. But it's not a general, we don't recommend 16 of the major and minor essential nutrients on every farm because they're not needed.
One of the key bits of advice is Ants and Jeff Morton co-authored a book on soil fertility, and it's available at the Fertiliser Association of New Zealand website, FANS. So if farmers want to think about fertility in a deeper way or do their own work, go to the FANS website. Ben, maybe we can post a link on the end there and go and have a look.
Absolutely.
And those booklets there are for both cropping, trace elements, and fertiliser requirements for dairy and cropping situations. It's a golden resource.
Excellent, guys. Hey, any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
All I'd say is fertiliser nutrients are an important part of a healthy, productive soil from a dairy farm perspective. And so the more attention you spend on making sure you're getting it all right will be beneficial for your productivity, your profitability, but also for environmental management as well.
Set up your spring, set up your crops, and then everything else you can be discretionary after Christmas and adjust the spread. But don't do shortcuts prior to Christmas, because that's where you make your money, and look at discretionary spend after Christmas in terms of fertiliser. And I hope you have a great season.
Good man. Ants and Warwick, thank you very, very much for coming on and providing such great practical advice for our listeners.
Pleasure, Ben.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks again to Ants and Warwick for your time and expertise on today's podcast. And thanks to all of you for listening in. Check the show notes for a link to the fertiliser use on New Zealand Dairy Farms booklet and some useful links on the DairyNZ website. Catch you next time.